At exactly 11:43 p.m., the river stopped making noise. Not slowed, not softened. It went silent. The Ashley River had always spoken at night, water pressing against the reeds, insects buzzing in waves, wood creaking along the docks. Even the wind usually had something to say. But on the night of June 17, 1844, every sound withdrew at once, as if Charleston itself had been ordered to hold its breath. 5 men vanished before dawn. They were among the richest plantation owners in South Carolina. Names carved into courthouses, names sewn into church banners, names that decided which families ate and which starved. They left separate estates that evening, traveling different roads, escorted by different servants. None of them arrived home. By sunrise, their horses were found wandering without reins. Their carriages were overturned but undamaged. No blood, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just belongings left behind with careful precision. Boots placed beside the road, watches laid open, Bibles resting face up as if mid-reading. The newspapers called it a regrettable mystery. The churches called for prayer. The city council sealed records. And then Charleston was told, very clearly, to forget. But forgetting did not come easily, because the river stayed quiet for weeks. Fishermen claimed the water felt thick, like syrup. Slaves whispered that the tide pulled backward at night. Children woke screaming from the same dream. 5 faceless men standing knee-deep in black water, mouths opening in unison, trying to say something they no longer remembered. By the end of that summer, 3 orphanages would quietly close. 2 churches would burn under unexplained circumstances. And a forgotten ledger, never meant to be read, would disappear from the basement of St. Jude's Seminary. All of it connected, all of it buried. This is not a ghost story. This is a story about power and what it does when it believes it is untouchable. About faith used as a lock instead of a light. About children who learn too early how silence works. Because the 5 men did not simply vanish. They were taken, and what took them had been waiting beneath Charleston for a very long time. In the next section, we will rewind the city, brick by brick, back to the beliefs that built it and the secret covenant signed long before the night the river went quiet. Charleston liked to call itself a holy city. Church spires pierced the skyline like fingers pointing toward heaven. Bells rang on schedule. Sermons spoke of mercy, order, and God's favor. On paper, it looked clean, blessed, proper. But cities, like people, are not what they claim to be. They are what they hide. By 1844, Charleston had already learned how to bury things well. Beneath the brick roads and manicured gardens were older layers. Wooden foundations rotting in damp soil, forgotten burial pits, sealed basements filled with records no one wanted to explain. Every new church was built on land taken from someone else. Every plantation expanded over ground that had already swallowed screams. The 5 men who vanished did not rise by accident. Their families had been powerful for generations. Not just wealthy, but protected. When laws shifted, they remained untouched. When scandals surfaced, witnesses disappeared or recanted. Ministers preached forgiveness before questions could be asked. And always, the same places appeared in the background. St. Jude's Seminary, the Magnolia Orphan Home, the Riverwatch Chapel. These were not just buildings. They were systems. They handled children without families, confessions without records, donations without receipts. They existed in a space where faith replaced oversight. In Charleston, belief was not just spiritual. It was administrative. Young boys arrived at orphanages after midnight. Girls were reassigned to service placements with no paperwork. Seminaries accepted students who had no names listed in public registries. When parents asked questions, they were reminded of God's will and the dangers of doubt. The 5 plantation owners funded all of it. They sat on church boards. They paid for expansions. They personally selected which children were worthy of guidance. Their signatures appeared again and again in ledgers marked private, sacred, not for public reading. What no one said out loud, but many felt, was that Charleston ran on a second set of rules. Rules whispered between men behind locked doors. Rules that treated suffering as a resource. Rules that assumed silence could be taught. And for decades, it worked. Until the children grew older. Until the river began to listen. Until the men who believed they owned the past realized too late that the past had been watching them closely. The night they vanished was not random. It was scheduled. In the next section, We will follow the paper trail no one was meant to trace. An inventory that listed no crops, no land, no money. Only names, ages, and a final column labeled disposition. The ledger was not hidden. That was the most disturbing part. It sat on an open shelf in the lower archives of St. Jude's Seminary, resting between baptism records and hymn revisions. No lock, no warning, no effort to disguise it, as if the men who placed it there believed no one would ever truly look. It was discovered in 1847, 3 years after the disappearances, by a young clerk named Elias Rowe. He had been sent underground to inventory flood damage after a minor storm. Most of the basement smelled like damp paper and candle wax. But one room, small, windowless, stone-lined, was dry. Perfectly dry. The ledger lay inside. Its cover was plain brown leather, worn soft by hands. No title, no date. When Elias opened it, he expected expenses, donations, maybe land transfers. Instead, the first page listed names. Children's names. Some had last names. Many did not. Ages ranged from 6 to 17. Beside each name was a column labeled Origin, Orphanage, Plantation, Ward of the Church. Then came the final column. Disposition. Some entries said transferred. Others said returned. Too many said completed. There were no explanations. Elias later wrote, before his own disappearance, that the pages felt wrong. Too smooth. As if they had been handled constantly, but never allowed to gather dust. He claimed the ink darkened the longer he stared at it, like it was still drying. At the back of the book were 5 signatures. The same 5 men. What chilled Elias most was not the list itself, but the dates. The final entries were marked June 17, 1844, the exact night the plantation owners vanished. Below the last name, someone had written a sentence in a different hand. The river keeps what the church could not. Elias tried to report the ledger. He told a minister, then another. Both advised him to rest, to pray, to forget what he thought he saw. One warned him gently that curiosity could damage a man's soul. 2 weeks later, Elias Rowe failed to return to work. His room was found empty, his belongings neatly arranged. The ledger was gone from the shelf, but no sign of forced entry was ever reported. Yet copies existed. Because Elias had made one mistake the powerful never expect. He had told a child. In the next section, we will hear the testimony that survived when everything else was erased. The memory of a boy who learned early that God and men do not always speak with the same voice. The boy's name was Samuel. At least, that's the name he was given at the Magnolia Orphan Home. Whether it was his birth name no one could say. Records before his arrival were blank. Just a line that read, received, age unknown. Samuel did not pray. That was what set him apart. Every morning and every night, the other children folded their hands, bowed their heads, and repeated the words they had been taught. Samuel stood silently, eyes open, watching. When asked why he refused, he said something that unsettled the caretakers. I already told him everything, he said. He didn't answer. By the time Elias Rowe met him, Samuel was 12. Thin, quiet, the kind of child adults forgot the moment they turned away. Elias spoke to him in the courtyard while pretending to inspect cracked stone. He showed the boy the copied pages folded inside his coat. Samuel didn't look surprised. He said he had seen the book before. Not the whole ledger, but pieces of it. Names written on slates. Lists recited aloud in offices with doors closed. He said children were sometimes called out at night, one by one, told they were being chosen. They were bathed, dressed clean, and told to be grateful. They never came back. Samuel said the adults told them it was God's work, that some children were meant to help carry the city's sins away. That pain could be useful if it stayed hidden. But it wasn't God, Samuel whispered. It was the river. He said the men took them down to the water. Not all at once. In groups small enough to stay quiet. The river wasn't violent. It didn't thrash or scream. It accepted, and it remembered. On the night the 5 men vanished, Samuel said the orphanage woke to something new. Not fear, anticipation. The water outside the windows moved the wrong way. Candles burned blue. The children felt like someone had finally heard them. By morning, the men were gone. Samuel ran away 2 days later. No one looked very hard. Years later, fragments of his testimony would surface in court petitions, church complaints, even a single unsigned letter sent to a Charleston newspaper in 1861. All dismissed, all buried. But the river never forgot his name. In the next section, we will examine the 5 men themselves, not as pillars of society, but as participants in a system that believed suffering could be managed like property. History remembered them as gentlemen. Portraits showed calm faces, clean collars, hands resting lightly on books they never read. Their names appeared on plaques, endowments, and pews reserved for the righteous. In Charleston, these 5 men were spoken of as if they were necessary, like stone, or law, or weather. But power changes how people listen to themselves. Each of the 5 believed he had been selected, not by chance, not by luck, by something older, something they never named, but always obeyed. They met 4 times a year, never in the same place twice. Sometimes a plantation house, sometimes a church basement. Once, according to a surviving receipt, aboard a river barge with no recorded destination. These meetings were not written down. No minutes, no prayers, just agreements made between men who trusted silence more than ink. They spoke of the city as if it were sick. They said Charleston needed balance, that suffering already existed, so it might as well be directed. They convinced themselves that taking pain from many and placing it into a few was mercy, that children without parents were already lost and could be useful. This is how cruelty survives, not as rage, but as logic. One of the 5 lost a son to fever. Another buried a daughter after a fall from a staircase no one saw. Their grief did not soften them. It hardened them. They began to believe loss was currency, that if they paid enough of it forward, they would be spared. The river became part of this belief. They didn't worship it. They used it. They said water cleansed, that it carried things away, that whatever happened beneath its surface was no longer their responsibility. They built rituals that sounded like prayer but felt like contracts. Always at night, always quiet. They never imagined the river was listening. By 1844, they had grown careless, confident. Children vanished faster. Records became sloppy. The ledger filled quickly. And then, without warning, the balance shifted. The night they disappeared was the first time the rules turned against them. The first time they were not the ones deciding who would be taken. In the next section, we will follow that night step by step, from dusk to silence, and watch the system collapse from the inside. The final meeting began at sundown. No servants were dismissed, but none were invited closer. Lamps were lit and then covered. Windows were shuttered though the night was warm. The 5 men arrived separately, each carrying the same unease they refused to name. They met near the river, not in a house, not in a church, on land that had never been consecrated. A stretch of ground locals avoided because animals refused to graze there, because the soil stayed damp even in drought. They told themselves it was practical. That night's ledger was short. Only 3 names. 2 boys, 1 girl, younger than usual. The men argued briefly, then agreed. They always agreed. What changed was the river. It did not move as expected. The current slowed, then shifted. The water darkened without clouds. One of the men laughed nervously and said it was just the tide. Another suggested postponing. No one listened. They began the ritual they had rehearsed for years. Words borrowed from scripture, rearranged just enough to sound holy. But halfway through, one of the men stopped speaking. He said he heard something. Not a voice, not a sound, a pressure, like standing too close to someone breathing in the dark. Then the water reached the shore, not in a wave, in a line, straight, controlled, intentional. The men backed away. Their boots sank into the wet ground that had been dry moments before. The children, silent, wide-eyed, were no longer where they had been placed. The river had taken them first. Then it did not stop. One by one, the men were pulled forward, not dragged, not attacked, but claimed, as if their weight suddenly belonged somewhere else. They dropped what they carried. Watches, books, rings, things meant to outlast them. The last man screamed, not for help, for forgiveness. By the time the river settled, there were no bodies, just stillness. In the next section, we will see how Charleston responded, not with grief, but with containment, and how an entire city learned to pretend nothing had happened. Charleston did not panic. That was the first lie. When 5 of its most powerful men vanished in a single night, the city did not descend into chaos. Shops opened on time. Church bells rang as scheduled. Plantations continued to ship goods downriver. On the surface, life moved forward with impressive discipline. But underneath, everything changed. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Sermons were rewritten overnight. Words like disappearance and investigation were replaced with trial and divine mystery. The city council issued a brief statement urging calm, then sealed the docks for 2 days without explanation. No rewards were offered. No suspects named. No searches organized. The servants who last saw the men were questioned separately, then dismissed permanently. Each was given a small sum of money and a warning disguised as advice. Leave the city, and do not speak about what you think you saw. Some obeyed. Some did not survive long enough to disobey. The churches were key. From the pulpits came a single message, repeated with subtle variations. God sometimes removes pillars to test the faithful. Grief was framed as selfish. Curiosity is sin. Anyone who asked why was reminded of Job, and of what happens to those who demand answers. Records disappeared quietly. Birth registries were amended. Orphan intake numbers adjusted downward. Pages were removed from old ledgers and replaced with clean paper. Even tombstones were prepared, 5 of them, erected without bodies, bearing dates, but no causes. The city called it closure. But closure requires truth. And Charleston had chosen something else. At night, people locked their doors earlier. Children were told not to play near the river. Fishermen avoided certain bends in the water where the current felt wrong. They said the river carried weight now. That nets came up heavy with nothing inside. The lie held for a while. But lies rot from the inside. They leave residue. They change the shape of things. And eventually, they demand maintenance. In the next section, we will follow the first crack in Charleston's silence. A fire that should never have spread, and a building that refused to burn cleanly. The first church burned on a windless night. Riverwatch Chapel had stood for nearly 60 years, its whitewood walls scrubbed weekly, its windows polished until they reflected the river like a mirror. It was known for order, for discipline, for sermons that stayed exactly within approved boundaries. When the fire started, there was no alarm. No one smelled smoke until the flames were already climbing the steeple. People rushed in buckets from the river, but the water would not behave. It soaked the ground, soaked the walls, and did nothing. The fire burned hot and clean, consuming the building faster than anyone could understand. By dawn, nothing remained but the foundation. And the shadows. On the stones where the chapel had stood, 5 dark shapes were burned into the ground. Not scorched randomly, but outlined. Human-sized. Perfectly still. As if something had been there long enough to block the heat, then stepped away at the last moment. The city removed the stones within hours. Officials said the marks were stains. Coincidence. A trick of ash and fear. But the men who lifted the stones reported something stranger. The ground beneath was cold. Not cool. Cold enough to numb the fingers. Within a month, a second church caught fire. Then a third. Each time, the same pattern. No accelerant. No witnesses. No spread beyond the intended structure. And always, something left behind that did not fit. Burn patterns that resembled kneeling figures. Handprints too large or too small to belong to any adult. The fires stopped as suddenly as they began. But the damage was done. People whispered that the city was being weighed. That something beneath it had been disturbed. Ministers preached louder. Longer. With less conviction. Orphanages closed for renovation and never reopened. And the river kept changing. In the next section, we will return to St. Jude's Seminary, where a locked room was opened for the first time in decades, and what was found inside forced even the faithful to look away. St. Jude's Seminary had always claimed every room served a purpose. Classrooms, dormitories, prayer halls, storage. Even the basement archives had labels nailed to their doors. Order mattered there. It made men feel closer to God. But there was one door without a label. It sat at the end of a narrow corridor below the seminary, past the rooms that smelled of old paper and oil lamps. The walls near it were thicker, the air colder. Students were told it led to a collapsed foundation and that there was nothing worth seeing. After the fires, someone finally unlocked it. Inside was no collapse. The room was square, stone on all sides. No windows, no altar, no chairs. The floor sloped gently toward a shallow drain cut directly into the rock. Iron rings were embedded along the walls. Old, rusted, carefully spaced. There were markings. Not scripture. Not numbers. Lines. Scratches. Repeated symbols carved at a child's height. Some overlapped. Some were crossed out violently, as if someone had tried to erase them with bare hands. In the center of the room lay a wooden box. Empty. But the lid was carved with the same word, written again and again in uneven letters. Remember, the men who entered the room did not stay long. One vomited. Another began praying and could not stop. The seminary rector ordered the doors sealed again before sunset. He said the room was a relic of older construction, a misunderstanding, a danger to weak faith. No report was filed. But after that day, St. Jude's changed. Students complained of hearing water at night, slow dripping sounds that did not come from pipes. Candles went out on their own, and one boy claimed he woke to find wet footprints leading from the sealed corridor to his bed. He was expelled for lying. Within a year, enrollment dropped sharply. Donations slowed. The seminary survived, but something essential had cracked. Because the room had not been built for worship, it had been built for containment. In the next section, we will uncover the final role the orphanages played, and why children were moved so carefully between institutions that pretended not to know each other. Children did not arrive at the orphanages the way people imagined. There were no welcoming committees, no formal goodbyes. Most arrived after dark, escorted by men who never signed their names. Wagons without markings. Carriages that took long routes to avoid main roads. And just as quietly, children left. Transfers happened at night. Always at night. The official reason was safety. Less attention. Less danger. But the truth was simpler. Darkness kept count better. The Magnolia Orphan Home kept 2 ledgers. One public, one private. The public one listed meals, donations, and adoptions that never quite added up. The private one, never meant to exist, tracked something else. Suitability. Children were evaluated not by behavior, but by endurance. Who cried the least? Who healed the fastest? Who learned silence without being taught? Those who asked too many questions were moved quickly. Those who stopped asking were marked. Selected. Some were sent to St. Jude's for education. Some were assigned to plantations for service. Some were taken to the river. The caretakers told themselves stories to survive. That the children were being prepared. That suffering built character. That God tested the young more harshly because they were closer to purity. But children know when adults are lying. They learn to communicate without words. To scratch marks into bed frames. To trade looks instead of names. They learned which footsteps meant safety and which meant it was time to hide. And they learned the most important rule. If you survive, you remember. That memory spread. By the early 1840s, children were running away more often. Slipping out through kitchens, windows, prayer halls. Some drowned. Some vanished. Some made it out of Charleston entirely, carrying pieces of a story they did not yet understand. Those memories did not die. They waited. In the next section, we will follow one of those children into adulthood and watch what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. He returned to Charleston under a different name. Older, broader in the shoulders, with scars that didn't come from work. No one recognized him, and that was the point. The city had a short memory for children who survived, especially those who left without permission. But he remembered everything. He remembered the smell of damp stone, the sound of water moving where it shouldn't, the way adults avoided looking at him once he stopped crying. As a boy, he had been called Thomas. At Magnolia Orphan Home, he learned to be invisible. At 12, he ran. At 14, he worked the docks in Savannah. At 19, he joined a river crew heading north. By the time he returned, he had learned how to listen without reacting. Charleston felt smaller than he remembered. The churches were still standing, but quieter. The orphanages, mostly gone. The river, different. Heavy, like it carried too many thoughts at once. He didn't come back for revenge. He came back because the dreams had followed him. Every few months, the same image, a line of water reaching for shore. 5 shapes beneath the surface, facing upward. Waiting, not angry, expectant. Thomas, now calling himself Henry, took a job as a clerk. Paperwork. Safe. Boring. From there, he did what he had learned as a child. He watched. He noticed how certain families still avoided the river at night. How some ministers refused to speak the names of the 5 men. How old servants went quiet when St. Jude's was mentioned. And then he found it. A partial copy of the ledger. Not the original. Just pages. Folded inside a private estate inventory, mislabeled and forgotten. Names he recognized. Names scratched into bed frames decades earlier. His own name was there. Marked completed. Henry did not tell anyone. Instead, he began leaving things where they would be found. A page slipped into a pew Bible. A name carved into a dock post. A word written in chalk near the river's edge. Remember, people noticed, and the river responded. In the next section, we will see how memory itself became dangerous, and why Charleston began to fear not the past, but those who refused to forget it. Charleston had lived a long time pretending memory was optional. What Henry was doing made people uncomfortable, not because they understood it, but because they felt it. A word here, a name there, nothing overt, nothing that could be punished, just enough to disturb the surface. People began avoiding certain pews. Dockworkers refused night shifts near specific bends of the river. A minister tore a page from a Bible after seeing a name written in the margin that did not belong there. The city called it vandalism. Privately, they called it something else. Contagion. Because memory spreads quietly. It does not announce itself. It moves through glances, through half-finished sentences, through the sudden urge to lock a door that was always left open before. Old men started having dreams they hadn't had in years. Women woke up crying without knowing why. Children who had never been to the orphanages, began drawing the same thing in the dirt near the river. 5 shapes, 1 line of water, no faces. The city council met twice that month. No records were kept. After the second meeting, Henry noticed he was being followed. Not closely, not obviously, just enough to remind him that the city still knew how to protect itself. He didn't stop. He left one final page of the ledger in a place no one could ignore, inside the donation box at Riverwatch's rebuilt chapel. Sunday morning. Full congregation. The page surfaced during counting. By nightfall, the river rose. Not flooding. Not raging. Rising with intention. Boats broke free from their moorings. Nets tore under invisible weight. The waterline crept higher than it should have, stopped, then held, as if waiting for something to happen next. Charleston understood then. This wasn't punishment. It was pressure. In the next section, we will witness the city's final attempt to bargain, with faith, with history, and with the river itself. Charleston had always believed in negotiation. When storms threatened, they prayed. When markets failed, they adjusted. When laws changed, they found loopholes. So when the river rose and did not flood, when it hovered like a held breath, the city did what it always did. It tried to bargain. Ministers organized a night of prayer along the banks. Candles were placed at measured distances. Hymns were chosen carefully. Words about forgiveness, sacrifice, and renewal were spoken with practiced calm. But no one mentioned the children. Not once. The men leading the prayers avoided looking at the water. They faced inward, toward each other, as if God lived only where it was safe to look. Their voices echoed strangely, bending in ways sound should not bend. The river did not respond. So the city tried something else. Henry disappeared. His room was found clean. His papers gone. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Just absence, wrapped neatly in routine. The official story said he had moved on, that he had never belonged to Charleston in the first place. But that night, the river finally moved. Not forward, backward. The current reversed for nearly an hour. Boats spun slowly in place. Reflections twisted the wrong way. And beneath the surface, something shifted, as if making room. People standing near the water heard it then. Not a voice, not words. A collective memory pressing upward. Charleston realized too late that the bargain had already been made long ago, and it had never been honored. In the next section, we will see what happens when a system built on silence is forced to listen all at once. The city woke differently the next morning. Not louder, quieter. People spoke less. Horses refused to cross certain streets. Dogs whined at doors they had passed through 1,000 times without hesitation. The river had returned to its normal direction, but nothing felt resolved. Because something had changed in the people. Memories that were not theirs had begun to surface. A woman washing her hands froze, suddenly overwhelmed by the feeling of cold stone beneath her knees. A dockworker dropped his tools, heart racing, after smelling damp wood and realizing he knew that smell too well, though he had never been below St. Jude's. A child began crying during breakfast, insisting he had dreamed of standing in water that reached his chest while adults argued behind him. These were not dreams. They were fragments. Charleston had spent decades distributing pain into hidden places, believing that distance erased responsibility. But memory does not respect walls. It does not obey titles or time. Once disturbed, it looks for somewhere to live. And it found people. Confessions began quietly, not in churches. Those had lost their authority, but in kitchens, on porches, in whispers shared after midnight. Old caretakers admitted things they had sworn never to say aloud. Former seminarians spoke of rooms they had been told never existed. Servants recalled night trips they were paid to forget. The pattern emerged too clearly to deny. Children had been taken. Faith had been used to justify it. The river had been used to erase it. And now, the eraser was gone. City leaders urged calm, called it hysteria, claimed grief had finally surfaced after years of repression. But the words no longer held weight. People had felt the memories settle into them like borrowed bones. The silence that once protected Charleston had turned against it. In the next section, we will return to the river itself and understand why it waited, why it listened, and why it acted only when memory was finally strong enough to be shared. Rivers are patient. They do not rush judgment. They do not argue. They accept what is given to them and carry it forward, layer by layer, season by season. Charleston believed this made the river useful. They were wrong. The Ashley did not forget the children. It did not cleanse what was placed into it. It held everything, names, fear, unfinished prayers, pressed into its current like sediment. Over time, those things did what water always does. They found balance. For decades, the river listened. It learned the city's patterns. It learned who came at night and who never looked down. It learned the difference between those who believed and those who obeyed. And it waited, because memory alone is not enough. Memory needs witnesses. The children had remembered. A few survivors had remembered. But memory locked inside one body is fragile. It can be dismissed, isolated, called madness. What changed was scale. When Henry returned, when the ledger resurfaced, when names were spoken aloud again, even without understanding, the memories crossed a threshold. They stopped belonging to individuals and began belonging to the place itself. That is when the river moved. Not out of anger, out of correction. The 5 men were not punished. They were rebalanced, taken the same way they had taken others. Quietly, without spectacle, without witnesses who could intervene. The river did not want justice as people define it. It wanted symmetry. And once that symmetry was restored, it began to give something back. Fragments surfaced. Not bodies, but objects. A child's shoe caught in reeds. A slate with half a name etched into it. A ring recognized by a family who had sworn their son never existed. These things appeared without explanation. Charleston tried to collect them, to hide them again. But it was too late. People were already looking. In the next section, we will see how the city attempted to close the story, how it tried to write an ending that would protect what was left of its power. Charleston decided the story was finished. That was the word they used. Finished. A small committee was formed, quietly, without announcement. They reviewed what could not be denied anymore and ignored everything else. Statements were drafted with careful language. Nothing direct. Nothing that admitted intent. They called it mismanagement. They called it moral failure. They never called it cruelty. A single report was released years later, buried among shipping data and census corrections. It mentioned irregularities in orphan records. It acknowledged that mistakes may have occurred. It suggested the river disappearances were the result of poor navigation and unfortunate weather. No names were listed. No apologies made. The city erected a plaque near the river, not to mark what happened, but to honor the resilience of Charleston through troubled times. People passed it daily without reading past the first line. On paper, the matter was closed. But stories do not end when institutions say they do. They end when the truth is allowed to breathe. The buildings connected to the events were repurposed. St. Jude's Seminary became offices, then storage, then was quietly demolished. The land was sold cheaply. Buyers reported trouble keeping tenants. Pipes burst without cause. Floors warped as if soaked from below. The river returned to normal behavior. Mostly. But some nights, when the city was very still, the waterline would creep just a little closer to shore. Not threatening, just present. A reminder. Children born decades later still dreamed of standing in water they had never entered. Still drew shapes they were never shown. Still asked questions their parents could not answer. Charleston told itself this was coincidence. The river did not argue. In the next and final section, we will step back from the city and understand what the Charleston Incident really was and why it was never meant to be remembered, but never could be forgotten. History later called it the Charleston Incident. That name made it smaller, safer, like a storm, like an accident. But what happened was not sudden, and it was not a mystery. It was a system reaching the end of its patience. For years, Charleston believed control meant silence, that if suffering was kept quiet enough, it would stop being real. They confused faith with obedience and order with goodness. They built institutions that looked holy from the outside and empty on the inside. And they taught children that pain was normal if it came with a prayer. The incident was not the night 5 men vanished. That was only the moment the balance shifted. The incident was every night before that. Every ledger entry, every locked door, every child told to be grateful for being chosen. The river did not create the horror. It revealed it. That is why the story never fully went away. Why it slipped through records and dreams and unfinished conversations. Why it survived without documents, without trials, without names carved into stone. Because the truth was not fragile. It was heavy. And heavy things sink until something strong enough pushes them back up. Charleston tried to forget, but forgetting requires agreement. And the city never had it. Not from the children, not from the survivors, not from the place itself. What people felt in the years after was not haunting. It was inheritance, a quiet understanding passed down without words. That power without witness becomes hunger. That silence can be taught. And that memory always looks for somewhere to live. The incident was not supernatural. It was human, and that is what made it unbearable. In the next section, we will listen to what remained after everyone who could be blamed was gone, and why some stories choose to stay unfinished. Long after the reports were filed and the buildings were gone, small things kept surfacing. Not enough to reopen anything, just enough to unsettle. A child's shoe found in the mud after a low tide. Too old to belong to anyone alive. Too intact to have traveled far. A slate pulled from the riverbank with letters worn almost smooth, except for one word still deep and clear. Remember, people who found these things rarely kept them. They felt wrong to own. Most were placed back where they were found. Some were buried. A few were handed to priests who no longer knew what to do with them. The river did not insist. It had already done what it came to do. What lingered instead was a change in behavior, a softness around certain questions, a hesitation before repeating old justifications. Families who once boasted about their ancestors now skipped certain names without explanation. Charleston grew quieter about its past. Not silent, just careful. Children continued to dream. But the dreams shifted. Less fear, more watching, as if they were no longer being called, but acknowledged. And the river, at night, sometimes reflected faces that were not there. Not clearly, not enough to cause panic. Just enough to make people pause before turning away. The incident was never taught in schools. It appeared nowhere in official history. But it lived in places that could not be erased, in habits, in pauses, in the way people spoke about power when they thought no one was listening. Because some stories do not need endings. They need witnesses. In the final section, we will leave Charleston behind and understand why this story surfaced at all and why it always will. Stories like this do not survive by accident. They survive because someone chooses not to look away. The Charleston incident was never written down in full. There was no single document to destroy, no trial to discredit, no confession that could be retracted. What remained lived in fragments, memories, behaviors, inherited silences. That made it dangerous. Because fragments move. They slip between generations. They attach themselves to new places, new institutions, new people who believe they are starting clean. The details change, but the structure remains the same. A system that believes it is righteous. A group that decides suffering is necessary. A promise that silence will keep everyone safe. That is why this story resurfaced. Not because the past wanted revenge, but because the pattern still exists. Charleston was not unique. It was early. It showed what happens when power stops listening and faith becomes a shield instead of a responsibility. When children are treated as problems to be managed instead of people to be protected. The river did not choose sides. It responded to pressure. And pressure always builds again. The reason this story feels heavy is because it is not finished. Not really. It does not belong to one place or one century. It belongs anywhere silence is rewarded and questions are punished. That is why remembering matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to stop creating new ones. In the final section, we will close this descent, not with comfort, but with clarity, and leave you with the one thing Charleston tried hardest to erase. Charleston believed that if enough time passed, the story would dissolve, that memory would thin out, that witnesses would die, that names would lose their meaning. They were right about one thing. Time does change stories, but it does not weaken them. It distills them. What remains after time is not detail. It is truth in its simplest form. And the truth Charleston could not erase was this. What is hidden does not disappear. It waits. The 5 men vanished because they believed themselves untouchable, because they mistook order for morality and faith for permission, because they thought silence was the same as consent. The river did not act as judge or executioner. It acted as a mirror. It returned what had been placed into it, only stripped of excuses. That is why there were no bodies, why there was no spectacle, why there was no ending neat enough to be framed. The incident was not meant to scare. It was meant to warn. Every system that relies on secrecy tells itself the same lie. No one will remember. Every generation that benefits from silence tells itself, it wasn't us. Charleston tried to bury the past beneath water, prayer, and paperwork. But memory does not need monuments. It needs acknowledgement. And when acknowledgement is denied, memory finds other ways to surface. In dreams, in habits, in stories like this one. That is why you're hearing it now. Not because the past is haunting you, but because the present still needs witnesses. The river has moved on. Charleston still stands. Life continues. But somewhere, in places that look ordinary and safe, silence is being taught again. And somewhere else, memory is listening. This was the Charleston Incident. Not a legend. Not a ghost story. A reminder. The Forgotten Files.